You all to New York Financial Writers Association event. It's a book talk with the authors of this book, which also appears in Lisa's background. It's called Welfare for the Rich: How Your Tax Dollars End Up in Millionaires' Pockets and What You Can Do About It. Recommended by Phil Harvey and Lisa Conyers. So I'm going to start out by just asking Phil and Lisa to just tell us a little bit about the book. Give us the bottom line just to get the conversation started. Phil, you want to go first?
Sure. We found in writing an earlier book about 4 years ago about the American welfare system that while there were a lot of things wrong with our welfare system for low-income people, for the genuinely poor, at least the correct beneficiaries of government largesse had been singled out. The basic welfare programs are income tested, and you don't qualify unless your income is quite low. But in the process of doing that book and finding many problems, as you would expect with the system, we kept coming across instances where welfare payments, or things that looked to us an awful lot like welfare payments, were going not to poor people, but to very wealthy people. And after scratching our heads a bit, I mean, we weren't totally unaware of this, but the extent of it seemed to just grow and grow and grow. And we began to feel that people needed to know the massive extent of federal government and state government and even local government payments are going to things, to people like farmers who don't farm, and team owners who want to build stadiums with taxpayer money, and a whole variety of other ways of subsidizing everything from coal and oil to wind and solar. We felt that having seen so much of this turning the Robin Hood syndrome on its head, that is, taking from modest income taxpayers and giving it to millionaires, and in a good many cases billionaires, that we should write a book about it. And that's what motivated us to get started.
Okay, good. Lisa, you have anything to add on that?
Well, just that it was so surprising as we went about writing the book. We both thought we had, as Phil said, we thought we had sort of a handle on, the fact that, yeah, some guys get some money from the federal government or state government. And then as we moved along, we just kept having to add chapters because there were just so many examples, This one we thought we were done. It's like, wait, what? The technology industry gets massive benefits? What's that all about?
Yeah.
It was just a shocker, and I think most Americans aren't aware of the extent to which their taxpayers end up in the pockets of people that really, really don't need it. And so it's sort of a rage read, in terms of just, there's a lot of just stuff that'll just make you want to scream. But and for both books, I spent about half time on the road looking for stories to add. And interviewing people around the country. And it was interesting to discover how few people, it's not a partisan issue. It's everybody's angry about it. It's the one issue I think all Americans probably unite around, is that they're frustrated by it. And when they hear stories from their local communities or at the federal level, they just shake their heads and say, no, this isn't right. I mean, why am I working and I'm paying my fair share? And why is it going to these people who certainly do not need the money?
So I'm gonna follow up with a question that you probably don't always get when you are asked about the book, because the audience here is writers. So they have, besides caring about the subject matter, they care a lot about how you did this. So please tell us a little bit about how you put this book together, how you divided responsibilities, both the reporting and the writing. Just talk us through that a little bit.
Well, we generally agreed on topics after initial research. Lisa did the lion's share of the research, all of these matters, or on most of them anyway. And once we had decided to do a book with this approach, with this subject, we agreed very easily on obvious cases like the Farm Bill and agricultural subsidies, on the use of taxpayer money for stadiums. Somewhat more complex are tax loopholes and tax advantages, the banking industry, and some others. So we discussed which ones should be pursued. And having done that, Lisa did all the original research and first drafts. I did some of it, but mostly I edited, and screamed at Lisa about paragraphing and sentence structure. But I think we.
Lisa's laughing.
Yeah.
Phil's a great editor.
I think gradually we polished it, and then got some excellent help from a professional editor named Carl Weber, who got the thing better organized, wrote some excellent subheads for chapters, tightened the book up, and I think that whole process, which I think will sound fairly familiar to a good many of your members, but it seems to have worked out.
Question for either one of you. Having gone through this a couple times now, what advice would you give to people who have not written a book yet but want to write a book?
Well, the first bit of advice I would give to anyone who wants to write a book is don't expect to make any money with it. Indeed, it's likely, one way or another, to cost you more than you will ever get in royalties. There are occasional rare exceptions, but it's like being a professional football player. You got one shot in a million. There are 50,000 or more than 50,000 books published every year in the United States, and that doesn't include the foreign one. So there's so many books out there that you're unlikely to be able to make a living at it. Very few people do, but the ones that do, of course, we admire and read. Let me give this question to Lisa, who will have a different angle on it, probably.
Yeah. Well, I would say that it's the start that stops most people. It's getting started. I meet people all the time that say they want to write a book, but actually it's a lot of work. Just, structuring the book. How's it going to flow? What are you going to talk about? What are you not going to talk about? How do you not get distracted and go down rabbit holes all the time? So it's, for me, what I find is just more than anything, it's like once you start, you're okay. It's just getting started that is hard for people. I think that it's been a really unique experience to be able to work with Phil, because working with a co-author means two people with two, very, different opinions about things. And it's a great exercise in cooperation and being able to hash out every part of a book with somebody else. Actually, I think is kind of fun. So if somebody's considering writing a book, they might consider a co-author, because it also just keeps your perspective and a second point of view. But if you have a very strong opinions about things, then you probably wouldn't like having a co-author, because you'd have to compromise. But yeah, and as far as the process, Phil described it, I think, very accurately in terms of how we went about it. Probably the most interesting thing I think about this book and our previous book on the welfare system is how much time I got to spend on the road all over the country interviewing people. And we wanted to do that because we wanted real stories in both of these books. I mean, both of these books are pretty wonky. So if you're, into the wonky side of life, there's plenty in there for you. But there's also stories and examples from the road, farmers that I interviewed in Indiana, or data center managers in Phoenix, or somebody out in Hawaii for some reason. And so that's what sort of keeps you going as you're getting through the wonky stuff is, oh, wow, that turned out that way for that guy. Or,
Sure.
oh, that
Yeah.
stadium owner really thinks that that's a good idea to spend money on a football stadium. What,
Mhm.
So,
Yeah. Were there any cases where the two of you had disagreements that were hard to resolve?
Not that I can think of. There were a couple topics in this book that we sort of, had to decide whether belonged in the book. As Phil mentioned, the tax stuff, some of the tax breaks were like, well, is that welfare, isn't it? But I think mostly we were on the same page. Would you agree, Phil?
Yes. You've picked one or two areas where we did have some disagreement. My own view of the charitable deduction in the tax code, for example, is somewhat biased because I depend on it very heavily.
Mhm.
And it is a great advantage to me. A lot of other people I think that it's a loophole deduction for high income people. And that is also arguably true. Um, but in general, I don't think we disagreed on anything long enough to slow down the evolution of the book.
Okay, great. I just want to tell the audience that we are accepting questions for the panelists. So write your questions into the chat box and I will ask them for you. You can do it at any time you want. And we'll just find a time when it fits into the flow of the conversation. So one of the things I'm going to ask, I'm going to go ahead and ask it while we're waiting for Phil to come back. So I'll direct this one to Lisa. Your previous book, the one you've mentioned a couple of times, was called The Human Cost of Welfare, How the System Hurts the People It's Supposed to Help. So to me, that's a message that appeals strongly to libertarians and conservatives, much less to progressives, whereas this new book probably has even broader appeal because everybody hates bailing out the rich. Can you talk about Phil, I'm going to direct this one to you in particular, your own political philosophy and how it fits into both of these books and the contrast between the two books.
Well, I am a confirmed hidebound libertarian, which is an astonishingly consistent political posture, and resulted in my feelings about the flaws with our welfare system for the poor, especially egregious because it tends to keep people out of work, dependent on welfare, and does a very, very, very poor job of getting low-income people back to work or into additional work. I remember vividly one young man who had been trying months and months and months to get a job so he could get off welfare, as the phrase has it. And he said, you go to the welfare office and all of the posters are about other welfare programs. Is why don't they put up job listings on the welfare office walls? They don't put up anything that's going to help me get work, which is what I really want. And that, I think, from a libertarian point of view, and also from the right as well, is the deadliest aspect of our overall $700 billion welfare program. I don't think Lisa disagreed with that, but there may have been other things that hit her more. But just in response to your question, that was That
Yeah.
was my hardcore libertarianism of speaking out. And with the new book, with the same philosophy, the idea that, well, I mean, libertarians are adamantly opposed to corporate welfare, for example, see no reason why the government should get involved in um, uh, providing subsidies and tax breaks for the energy companies and all kinds of different um, industries. Um, it, it is against libertarian philosophy and is against common sense, it seems to me, to use taxpayer funds to prop up, bail out, and generally support wealthy corporations and issues and organizations um, that that we do. And there's the basic unfairness issue that's most particularly strong in Lisa's case, I think, and she can certainly tell you a bit more about that. But it's wrong. I mean, you know, you just feel with this welfare for the rich stuff, it's just wrong. It's immoral. It's unethical. Shouldn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would say, in answer to your question as far as the politics of it, our book on welfare wasn't bashing the welfare system and saying we shouldn't be giving welfare to people. It was a book about how the welfare system prevents people from self-actualizing and getting out of the welfare system. And that our argument with it is that, why isn't it geared more towards lifting people out of poverty instead of sort of keeping them in poverty? The welfare system is designed so that you get just enough to live on, but the minute you make any money, you lose all those benefits. So there's a real incentive to stay in the system. And that was our big complaint, or one of our big complaints about the welfare system. And then this book is, you might think that it appeals more to the left, but I think, in my interviews around the country and my research, and this goes for the welfare system too, in both cases, there's sort of nonpartisan issues when you delve down into them. I mean, there were just as many people on the left who were frustrated by how the welfare system plays out as there were on the right. So I think both of these issues can be nonpartisan. Of course, if you go to the extremes, they can become partisan. But and I got just as frustrated by interviewing people on welfare for 4 years about their lives and about how hard it was and how much they didn't want to be in the system. And then when I got involved in this book, interviewing people who are basically paying for this largesse that we're giving to rich people, they were angry too, and they're taxpayers. So
Yeah.
there's a lot more common ground in this, hyper politicized environment we all live in right now. There's actually a lot of common ground on the ground when you interview, ordinary Americans. Their concerns are more about where's my money going, and is the government doing a good job the way they're spending it?
Yeah. We're starting to get some questions in from the audience, so I'll hit you with them. One of them, what is your opinion of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act? That was, of course, President Trump's signature piece of legislation in his first year in office. Good, bad, ugly, or ill-conceived? Do you see that as more welfare for the rich?
Well, some of it's good, some of it's bad. There's an awful lot of bad that in many people's minds, including, I suspect, Lisa's, that kind of overwhelms the good. I believe that our corporate tax rate was too high. It made American corporations very difficult for them to compete in a world economy. So that I think bringing down the corporate tax rate was a good move. On the other hand, while all taxpayers, particularly middle income and wealthy taxpayers, got some break, at least for some time, the big bucks in the bill accrued to the very wealthy, and I don't think I can defend that and wouldn't choose to.
All right. Another question we have from audience member. Can you put a dollar figure on how much welfare for the rich is granted annually in the U.S.?
Oh man, that's that's a tough one. I mean, it's so hard to quantify that because we're talking about, spending at the federal level plus your state level plus local level. So it's an impossible number. I wish I could put up one of those, counting those little digital clocks, sort of only it would be dollars of how much is spent every second. But I wouldn't want to venture. I mean, it's in the billions for sure, possibly trillions. There was one story we did out of Louisiana that was a big story, and I was interviewing one of the guys that was involved in overturning this one law that helped taxpayers get more money into their own hands. But as he was talking about this story, he said, I knew when I was onto something when I realized that I wasn't reading millions, I was reading billions. There was more zeros than I realized. It's just when you start looking at the numbers, it's pretty shocking. But no, I do not think I could put a hard number on it.
Yeah.
We're willing to say, or I'm willing to say, that it's in the hundreds of billions. A couple of years ago, the Cato Institute estimated corporate welfare at about 100 billion. And that was quite well and is quite well documented. And it remains an estimate, and that's just corporate welfare. It doesn't count the stadiums. It doesn't count the individual farmers and a whole lot of other things. But there are gray area cases. I mean, if, for example, the federal government gives a tax break to an entire industry, evenly, we would tend to favor that, not as a loophole, but as lowering of taxes, which libertarians generally favor. But if it's a targeted tax break going to one company and making that one company a favorite of a government policy, giving them an edge over their competition, that we call a loophole and would count that as part of the hundreds of billions of dollars that go inappropriately. Yeah. But there are things in between that make it very, very hard to say precisely what this cost is. But I think it's safe to say it's in the hundreds of billions of dollars. It is not small. It is a significant part of our overall budget for everything that we do in the country. And hundreds of billions is at least a notable fraction of the $4.5 trillion federal budget.
Yeah. Reminder to the audience, we're accepting questions. Please type them into the chat box or you can use Q&A. I'm going to, meanwhile, continue. Phil, you have a very interesting history. Can you tell us a little bit about your work history, how you made your money, and how that fits in with your libertarian philosophy today?
It's not as precise a fit as these two books are, but sure. I was very, very anxious back in 1965, approximately 66, to get into the family planning business worldwide. And to cut a very, very long story reasonably short, I met up with a man at the University of North Carolina where we were both studying international family planning programs. And we said, well, why don't we start in the United States with a way of providing contraceptives to people in this country who need it. And we decided that there was one thing missing in the United States, and that was condoms by mail, something that had been pretty popular in England and other European countries for a good long time. But we found when we looked into it that it was illegal to send condoms through the mail in the United States, even if they were FDA approved, top of the line condoms. So we decided that we would do that. We went ahead. We didn't get arrested, although we felt that if we did get arrested, we'd get a lot of pretty favorable publicity since teenage birth rates were running out of control at the time, and the idea of providing condoms to teenagers obviously needed them would be pretty appealing, we thought, across the board. Anyway, we did it. We didn't have any trouble with the law. And from that early days of mail order condoms, for which then there turned out to be a very substantial demand, we gradually built a business in sexually oriented merchandise, particularly now toys and lubricants, which has turned into a very profitable business. And just as an aside, it's a business providing sex toys, for example, a business that has grown very rapidly in the pandemic because people are staying home and they want to have fun.
What is the reaction you typically get when you tell people that you're in the sex toys business?
It's pretty positive. I mean, the extent of acceptance and interest in vibrators, for example, and in things that help women have orgasms is quite high. And the idea that it should be terribly controversial, we simply haven't found to be true.
Yeah. So how you actually pursued some court cases over, I believe, First Amendment rights on advertising and marketing of these devices, right? I mean, can you tell us a little about that and how that fits in with your libertarian philosophy?
Well, it only fits in insofar as libertarians believe in freedom and the freedom to sell condoms in stores other than pharmacies, which was what one of the lawsuits was about, seems normal and natural. But my pursuit of the family planning world in general, and of Adam and Eve, the mail order company, was not based on particular libertarian philosophies or beliefs. Mm-hmm. It just was what happened in my life, and I don't think I would have done anything to violate the tenets of libertarianism. But I wasn't. Sure. I wasn't conscious of it at the time, and it probably didn't have all that much influence.
Yeah. Now, I want to ask Lisa a question, because since you were on the road a lot, as you said, can you just tell us a couple, one or two of the stories that you came across that particularly made your blood boil when you were researching welfare for the rich?
Well, there's one that I love to tell because East Coasters might be familiar with Hartford, Connecticut, and Hartford, Connecticut has a new baseball team, and it's called the Hartford Yard Goats. So the Yard Goats team was bought by somebody who wanted to put a stadium in Hartford, Connecticut, and obviously a wealthy person who can afford to buy a baseball team. And rather than paying for that baseball stadium on his own, which he could have easily done, or with his buddies could have done it, he went to the city of Hartford, Connecticut, and asked them to foot the bill for the stadium. And they did. And so I happened to stumble across this story and decided it'd be really fun to go to Hartford and go to a baseball game at the stadium. So I was there for opening day, the first time the stadium opened. And it was just fascinating to interview people in the stadium. It was a freezing cold night. They had just this frost, that morning, and so everybody's all bundled up, and there's this Hartford Yard Goat, a mascot, running around the field in his, goat costume, and everybody's waving goat flags and stuff. But it was just such a typical example of, wait a minute, all these taxpayers. Hartford is not a wealthy town. It's surrounded by a wealthy area, but it's not a wealthy town by any means. They have lots of need. They have a high poverty rate. There's lots of things that the taxpayers' dollars could have been spent on besides a baseball stadium. And yet, here we were in the stadium and looking around and interviewing people. Everybody said, no, we're not from Hartford. We drove here to watch this game. So not only were taxpayers footing the bill for this thing, it wasn't even for them. It was for people from out of town who happened to be, fans of this baseball team. And the city is, well, at the time that I wrote the story, that researched it, the city was basically in the hole by about the same amount of money that they had spent on the stadium. So that, and so I'd interview people in Hartford. I'd say, well, how do you feel about your city being in the red, $70 million? And they're like, well, I guess people like baseball, and it just didn't seem to sink in that, wait a minute, you go to work every day, you pay your taxes, well, I would like to believe that they're being spent in responsible ways, but wait, you got a baseball stadium out of it? So the night of the game, I show up, and part of what this owner had convinced the city of Hartford was that, oh, well, if you build this stadium, they will, not only will spectators come, but hotels will be built around it and restaurants will be built around it. Well, I interviewed people that were looking at that who said, no way we're building in that part of town. It's a very depressed part of town. There's restaurants and hotel people that go to restaurants and hotels are not going to want to go to that part of town. And I show up at the stadium and it's ringed with police officers. And I thought the police were there. Oh, maybe they're helping with parking. Maybe they're helping with, I don't know, why are there a bunch of police outside of the stadium? Well, no, they were there for safety. And I just thought, what a bizarre, how did this happen? How did this owner decide that this was the way to go? And how did the city decide that, oh yeah, somehow this all makes sense when it doesn't make sense at all? So that was one that just, and there's just something about, it's funny that it's the yard goats and, it's just an interesting story. But there was a really a wonderful success story that I found down in Louisiana. It was absolutely the best success story that I found. And it has to do with property taxes that are paid in Louisiana. And all of those big oil companies that you see along the Gulf Coast, Dow and Exxon and Mobil and all those guys, they have not been paying property taxes since the 1930s. And nobody knew this. Somehow this just never really made the news, never crossed anybody's radar until a group of young people were looking at the USA Today rankings of the states that they publish every year. And Louisiana always ends up dead last in these surveys, the worst in, education outcomes, health outcomes, you name it, poverty levels. And these folks were looking at it and going, how can this be? We have all these really, wealthy corporations that are doing business here. We have all this, wealth of natural resources. Why don't we have any money? And they came across this tiny little committee of 5 people that had been rubber stamping property tax abatements for oil and gas companies and chemical companies in Louisiana for decades. And so then they started saying, okay, well, wait a minute, what if we had all that money? What if they had to pay property taxes like the rest of us? Wow, we would be rolling in the dough. And maybe we could pay for some more firemen, some more policemen, some more school teachers, and that kind of stuff. So they mounted a very effective public relations and public education campaign and started showing up at public meetings and saying, hey, this isn't right. We want this changed. And they were successful. I think it was 2019, they managed to get the law changed. So these companies can no longer go to this little committee and get a rubber stamp on their property tax abatement request. They have to go before a board that includes representatives from schools, police departments, fire departments, stakeholders in how things turn out in Louisiana. And it's going to be a while because these companies come back and say, oh, well, we'll just move, or hey, we're providing jobs. But I think over time you will see a change and you'll see them having to, pay their way. So it's not, all of these things are not insurmountable if people get together and decide to fight back and do something about it.
Great. It's nice to have some positive stories in the book, not all just negative. That's great. I had another question from a member of the audience. It's not exactly on the welfare for the rich, but I think you might find a link. It's, how do you evaluate the theory of trickle-down economics? Has it ever worked since the Great Depression in producing strong economy? Phil, you want to try that one?
Well, this is not our field or our area. Trickle-down economics has been much ridiculed. Less ridiculed are assertions like a rising tide lifts all boats, which to some extent that it does. Some extent it does. I certainly don't think that we have proof today, or even an indication today, that more wealth in the economy, which we certainly have compared with 10 years or 20 years or 30 years ago, means that people at the bottom of the heap are going to do better. In fact, we seem to have managed to prove, to disprove that assertion. I think the growth in the economy, the growth in productivity in the United States has been faster overall than the wages of average workers. We need to do something about that. I don't know what. There are a lot of, I think, not very effective ideas put forth to try to cope with wealth and income inequality. To me, inequality itself is a lot less important than the income and wages of everybody in the system who need to be able to hope and plan and think about a future that is better than it is economically today. But I'm getting way too far out of my area.
All right, well, let me bring a question to you that it's closer to the topic of the book, which is you mentioned President Trump a few times in the book, and a dog just came in the room.
Phil, your dog's in the room.
Well, hopefully you'll be quiet.
And meanwhile, by the way, if anybody hears harbor seals in the background, that's coming from Lisa. She's on her boat.
Yep.
But okay. The question I have is, again, about Trump. You ding him in one place for trade barriers, which you say are harmful to consumers and benefit entrenched corporate interests. You praise him in other places for reducing regulation. So what would be your net assessment of the Trump administration on the topic of welfare for the rich?
I would say not so good.
Bad. Yeah,
Bad.
bad. I mean, the tariffs hurt everyone, with the exception of perhaps just a small handful of people in a particular industry. And one of the first things he did was slap tariffs on washing machines from Korea. It's just stupid. I mean, all it does is mean that Americans pay more for their washing machines, and the Hot Point folks maybe sell a few more than they would have otherwise. But that's something that all of us are paying for, or at least everyone who wants to buy a washing machine is paying for, and a handful of people, really a tiny handful of people, may benefit from it. Tariffs on imports from Canada and Mexico, are arch enemies over the years, are just crazy. I mean, insupportable. The effect is to make things more expensive for American consumers. And the same thing happened with the Chinese. Many of the Chinese tariffs, they retaliated, which anyone could have told him they would. And I'm sure people did tell him they would. And the result was that a great many farmers in the West and Midwest suffered from a lack of a market in China. In terms of Trump's performance on trade, I would say it was absolutely terrible, including his failure to stay in the trade agreement with a TPP. Yeah.
Yeah. What about on regulation?
Well, the addition of federal regulations to the Federal Register has come way, way down, and an awful lot of those regulations should never have been. Well, let's put it this way: prior to Trump, the thirst and proliferation of regulations that got into everything in our lives, from the kind of toilets we can use to the number of peaches in our fruit cocktail, was a good deal more destructive than it has been under Trump, just because he insisted on eliminating, on saying no to new regulations on things where it wasn't terribly important. We may have also gotten rid of some regulations that were terribly important. I haven't studied this in great detail, but overall, the flood of regulation additions has gone down, and we think that's a positive development.
All right, well, that's good. Again, a reminder to the audience that we are taking questions. We're taking your questions. We'd love to ask them while the authors are still with us. We're going to keep going for a little while. If we're not getting a lot of questions, we're going to wrap it up a little before 1 o'clock. So 1 o'clock Eastern. So get your questions in now. I just want to go back to telling people a bit about the book. I just want to rattle off the different topics because we've only touched on a few of them, and there are a lot. As Lisa said earlier, they kept on coming up with new ideas for chapters. We started out with farm subsidies, then it's tariffs, then it's stadiums, then it's zoning, then it's some ones that are thumbs on the scale, big business tilting the rules, energy, tech, tax, banks, lobbying, and then finally joining forces and fighting back. And maybe that's what I'll turn to. Tell us about joining forces and fighting back. Lisa gave one great example out of Louisiana, but do you have any other things you can say for people who are thinking, I don't like this and I want to do something about it?
Well, the last chapter includes a lot of organizations that are already at work at things like this. And I think that the most important thing that I learned was how important transparency is and access to data. As your writers, I'm sure, are aware of, if you can access a budget and look at it, then you can analyze it, and see where the money's going. And there's the Sunlight Foundation is one organization, openthebooks.gov is another, that are basically putting all these budgets up in real time. So, me, the taxpayer, can get online and say, where's that money being spent exactly? And deciding, whether I want to fight back. And it's citizen activism, right? It's getting frustrated enough, like those people down in Louisiana did, and saying, look, I've had it. This just isn't right. I want to fix it. And so we really recommend getting involved at the local level, state level, federal level, whatever level you're comfortable with, and starting to speak out and find advocates like yourselves and if some guy's about to build a stadium in your neighborhood, look into it and see how much of your tax dollars is going towards it, or whatever the case may be. And I think that having that data available now is fairly new, and being able to look up. I mean, you can now get on a website and see every farmer in the United States and what kind of level of subsidies they're getting. Or, well, you could now they shield some of that information, but you can see where those farm subsidies are going and find out. It was interesting when I was in where was I? I was in Wisconsin, and I was interviewing this guy, and he wasn't a farmer, but we were interviewing on other issues, and I started telling him about the farm bill and about farm subsidies, and he's like, wait a minute, tell me more. So I started telling him about how farmers get paid to grow certain crops, or sometimes they get paid to not grow crops. And he said, wait a minute, I'm going to look up my neighbor next door. So he got on his laptop, and sure enough, he's like, wait, that guy's getting over $1 million in farm subsidies. I can't believe, so having that kind of information available.
Sure. Yeah. Great example. Phil, do you want to add anything on that?
Well, another organization we favor is called Good Jobs First. And they, like the ones Lisa mentioned, Sunlight and Open the Books, have websites that are the same as their names, which facilitates things. But they are working very, very hard to keep track of all this. And since your colleagues are writers, and you are too, I assume, getting the information and writing about it, particularly writing and publishing about some of the horrible waste that goes on, and that is documented by these groups. There's another one called POGO, which specializes in wasteful government spending.
Right.
is a big help. And for writers, boy, more op-eds and articles about the ripoffs that are taking place and the injustices, the infuriating injustices in some cases. One of my favorite examples is the time that the Farm Bill, which is a $96 billion a year subsidy to farms and farmers, many of whom are not farmers at all, is the time that Farm Bill money was used to support and subsidize a pheasant farm. Well, I'm all for pheasant hunting. I think it could be a marvelous sport for people who enjoy it, but I see no reason why I should be paying taxes in order to help people shoot pheasants. So that kind of example, that and the $200 toilet seat or whatever it was, I guess it was $600. Sometimes you can find something that really captures the imagination of the public, and it leads to change. I think the toilet seats are probably better priced for the military now.
It's true. Sometimes the little things like that become a lightning rod, and whereas something that costs tens of billions of dollars just slips right past people because they can't conceive of it. Well, look, this has been a fascinating conversation, and I'm not going to keep you because I think we've run out of questions from the audience. It's been really fun talking about the book. Again, I just want to remind people it's Welfare for the Rich, How Your Tax Dollars End Up in Millionaires' Pockets and What You Can Do About It, by Phil Harvey and Lisa Conyers. Thanks to both of you for joining the New York Financial Writers Association today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks a lot. Enjoyed it.
Okay, well, goodbye.